Mr. Clark's back. Time to take a look at the Carter Presidency, which is 18.6, Part 2. Please make sure that you have open your Google document for the 18.6 Part 2 focus questions. Be sure to fill out the responses as I go through the lesson. If I'm going too quickly, just so you can pause your video along the way to make sure you get down the responses. When you complete the entire handout, you must submit your responses in Google Classroom. All right, so as we continue our look here at the 1970s and President Carter, when we last left off, Jimmy Carter had defeated Gerald Ford for the presidency in 1976 in a very close election. And he inherited a number of different problems in the United States that were partially outside of his control. One of those issues was the energy crisis. So when you look at the energy crisis, during this period of time in the 1970s, we saw skyrocketing gas prices for a wide variety of different reasons. Part of the reason, and anytime you see the price of anything go up, it's a supply and demand situation. So the supply of oil and gas remained stagnant while the demand was going up significantly. There's also shortages at different points in time based on some of the political issues that were ongoing between the United States, Israel, who was our strong ally, and some of the Middle Eastern countries, which controlled much of the oil supply, or the OPEC countries. OPEC is something we had looked at previously. We even see today in contemporary times from a reverse perspective because of the pandemic that's ongoing in the United States and around the world. The demand for oil and gas has collapsed because basically people are really not leaving their homes. They're not driving, they're not commuting, and as a result, gas prices have collapsed. For example, my car, normally I put gas in my car twice a week, commuting, upwards of 500 miles a week back and forth from home to school. I haven't filled up my gas tank since probably the middle of March. So we're talking over a month now since I've gotten gasoline. The only time I got gas, I had to go get gas to put into my lawnmower to mow my lawn. Now that the weather's getting warmer, I'm mowing my lawn on a regular basis. Important information to know. All right, so anyway, back to what we're dealing here with question 23. Gas prices went from 40 cents a gallon in 1973 to $1.20 in 1979. There's parts of the United States today where gasoline's under $1 per gallon. Even in New Jersey, for the first time in many, many years, gas prices are under $2 in most gas stations around the state currently. By 1979, gas prices were high and the supply was so low that we had an extreme shortage of gasoline. You see two photographs there. Photograph on the left was limiting drivers to purchasing just 10 gallons of gas per time they come in. On the right side there, you might see the sign underneath where it says mobile. It says even numbers only. So similar to the situation that we had after Superstorm or Hurricane Sandy back in 2012. We had a situation where in New Jersey we had a ration gas and you can only get gas every other day based on the last number of your license plate. If it was an even day, you get gas in the even days. If it was an odd day, if your plate's last number was an odd day, then you can get gasoline. And that's what they were doing during the 1970s. I remember as a young child, probably around age 8 at that point in time, same size that I am now, but just 8 years of age. I was in the car with my mom, and we were sitting on Oak Tree Road in South Plainfield. You may have been on Oak Tree Road since it's not too far from Metuchen High School. And it was literally backed up for miles. And we sat there all day long, and there were a few cars that were in the line that you had to drive around because they literally ran out of gas waiting to get gasoline. That's how difficult it was to get gas back in 1979. So President Carter, he had to deal with the energy crisis. He gave a speech, and often presidents speak to the country in times of trouble. Sometimes it's reassuring when you hear from your president. Other times it's not such a positive experience. When you think about President Trump, obviously he has his positive and negative moments. And as I'm recording this lesson here, obviously he had just gone through a kind of a controversial conference where there was some discussion about disinfectants and bleach and things like that, and the use of it in terms of combating the coronavirus. And obviously, that's something that would not necessarily be medically recommended, and sometimes kind of goes off on some tangents that maybe not necessarily the best advice to be giving out to the general public. In the case of President Carter, in his crisis of confidence speech, he encouraged Americans to conserve energy. In his speech, he started the speech by saying that it's time for Americans to start sweating. And by sweating, it was the middle of the summer, and what he was advocating was that the United States and our citizens change the thermostat in their house. In the summer, you have your air conditioning on, and you use a lot of energy to run the air conditioner. And a lot of Americans might keep it on, let's say 69 degrees or 70 degrees, whatever it might be, to keep the house nice and cool. Well, he wanted you to put it on 77 or 78, where your house would be warm, not to the point in which it would be unhealthy, but it would be a situation where you'd be uncomfortable, and thus you might actually be literally sweating in your house because you're not running the air conditioner at a temperature that would make the house feel cool. He did do something positive. He created the Department of Energy. That's a new department that was added to the cabinet. The cabinet, as you recall, started out with just 4 cabinet secretaries, or 4 members of the cabinet. And the original 4 cabinet members under Washington had a Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of War or Defense, which was Henry Knox, and of course the first Attorney General, Edmund Randolph. So you had the Fab Four or the Core Four originally, then it was expanded here, and we've added secretaries along the way. And the Secretary of Education, the Environmental Protection Agency was added to the cabinet. More recently, we had the Director of Homeland Security that was added to the cabinet. So there's always positions as needs and issues, and the running of the country becomes more elaborate with the expanding population and such. We've always added cabinet secretaries to help out the president to better govern. He attempted to stabilize oil prices by putting a profit tax on oil companies. This was designed to bring more money in and maybe discourage Americans from perhaps buying oil or gas. It only hurt oil production because those who were privately funding oil exploration, if they had their profits taxed, they were less likely or less motivated to actually search for new oil reserves. President Carter passed the Community Reinvestment Act. This act enabled many people to own their own homes, especially minority groups or people with moderate or low incomes. However, this act in some ways contributed to some of the economic failures and the economic recession and the collapse of the homing industry and the mortgage industries back in 2008, 2007, the end of 7 into 8, and all the way up into 2011 when our economy was struggling at the end of the Bush administration, George W. Bush, and the Obama administration. Foreign policy challenges and changes under Carter. Carter's policy had some things in common with former President Nixon's foreign policy, as they both looked to relax Cold War tensions and kind of look for ways to cooperate with the Soviet Union. On the other hand, Nixon was more concerned upon making economic partnerships with foreign countries, where President Carter was more focused on human rights issues that were lacking in many countries around the world. Here's a couple of quotes from Jimmy Carter that I think play quite well into his overall philosophy on foreign policy. Carter stated, "America did not invent human rights. In a very real sense, human rights invented America." So if you go back to the issue of no taxation without representation, the American Revolutionary War, we wanted those basic human rights, and we fought a Revolutionary War to be free from British control. His second quote on the right, "We cannot be both the world's leading champion of peace and the world's leading supplier of the weapons of war." So he saw a contradiction between arming and building up of our nuclear weapons and our weapon stockpiles, while at the same point in time wanting peace. '27, how did President Carter react to the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979? He reacted, and when you look at any country, countries have many different weapons and many different things and actions they can take beyond just going to war. And one of the things they do is they try and hurt another country economically to kind of change their perspective or their policy. So we placed an embargo on the sale of grain to the Soviet Union, which would hurt their ability to function as a country. We also boycotted the Olympic Games, which were scheduled to be held in Moscow in 1980. So these are two small steps, kind of more symbolic gestures, one economic and the second one more symbolic. Another area where President Carter struggled was in regards to Panama. He was kind of looking at different ways to kind of move forward in regard to a treaty with the Panamanian government. He got Congress to approve a resolution to turn over control of Panama Canal to the Panamanians on December 31st, 1999. Many Americans were a little bit concerned about that because obviously that's a strategic location in the world, and obviously we feel, I guess, more secure if we have some voice or say there to oversee and ensure the safety of that region. But Carter negotiated out a turnover fully to the Panamanians on December 31st, 1999. The United States had controlled Panama Canal since 1903. One of the areas that's always most controversial and very tension-filled region is the Middle East, dating back to the period of time after World War II in 1947 when Israel was established in the wake of World War II and the establishment then of the United Nations. They established Israel as a homeland for Jews. There was a lot of tension between Egypt and Israel, and you can see President Carter in the center of that photograph there. To the left side of the photograph, or Carter's right, is Menachem Begin. He's Menachem Begin here on the right, and Anwar Sadat here on the left. So Sadat and with Carter, Begin, and Sadat. Sadat from Egypt, Begin from Israel, the prime minister, and Jimmy Carter, the president of the United States. They should have lined up the flags there behind the respective presidents or leaders. They didn't do that. So what they did here is they brought these leaders together. They were like long-standing enemies, and as a result, Jimmy Carter brought them to Camp David, which is a presidential retreat just outside of Washington, D.C. in the mountains. There, the three leaders kind of met for a series of what are called summit meetings, or world leaders who come together and to discuss big issues. And this is probably the greatest accomplishment of the Carter presidency. He was able to negotiate a peace settlement between Egypt and Israel. Next, we'll look at a foreign policy disaster for President Carter. It's going to involve Iran. First, let's look at the history of Iran. For a long period of time, the United States had propped up a brutal dictator, Reza Pahlavi, also known as the Shah of Iran. It was the Eisenhower administration who helped Pahlavi to get into power in Iran. And it was kind of like a hardliner, like a real strongman in terms of the way in which he governed. He didn't really care too much about the human rights of his own citizens. But because he was strongly anti-communist, the United States decided to continue to support him right into the 1970s. Many Iranians, of course, felt that their rights were being violated by the Shah's government, resented the United States' support. They also resented some of the Western reforms that the Shah had implemented. In January 1979, Islamic clerics forced the Shah to flee Iran. An Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini was created, and the Shah was out of power. He fled to the United States for safety. Of course, the Iranian people want the Shah returned to Iran to be put on trial for any crimes against their country. The United States refused to send the Shah back to Iran. So as a result, many Iranians who were bitter against American support of the Shah, they decided to seize the American embassy. Now, keep in mind, the United States has an embassy in every country around the world, as we did in Tehran, Iran, the capital city of Iran. So when the United States refused to send the Shah back, the Iranians, you can see the photograph on the bottom right there. That's the Ayatollah Khomeini here. It's a picture of him. They're climbing the gates here of the American embassy. They went in. They took 66 Americans hostage, and they said that they would not release the hostages until after the United States sent the Shah back to Iran to go on trial for the alleged crimes he had committed against his own citizens. So President Carter, he was a little bit uncertain during this ongoing saga. President Carter attempted a rescue that turned into a disaster. You see the photograph here. If you want to look at a video clip link, you can. It's posted on the document. When you look there at the helicopter, that's the Marine helicopter that went down, crashed in the desert. Several Americans were killed, 8 in total. And this was the attempt to rescue those hostages, which turned into a disaster. So Carter obviously took the blame for that failed rescue attempt, and he became really kind of nervous to take any more definitive action. So after the helicopter crash, President Carter did not do much of anything. For 444 days, the hostages were held. The Iranians would show pictures on TV, and the American media would cover it on a nightly basis. And so every night, basically, families across the country, they would turn on the news. And remember, we didn't have as many we didn't have as many TV channels back then. So almost everybody was watching the events of the Iranian hostage crisis. And in the top corner of the screen, it would say day 25, day 50, day 100, day 200. And basically, we're counting it all the way up to 444 days, well over a year. These 66 Americans were held hostage. Also, at the same time that this hostage crisis was ongoing, President Carter was attempting to run for re-election to the presidency in 1980. And ironically enough, when were the hostages released? They were released 90 minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president on January 20th, 1981. Some speculate, nobody knows for sure, but they felt that maybe Reagan would have been a little bit more definitive in taking military action in Iran. So therefore, the Iranian government realized they could no longer hold the Americans hostage. You can see here, welcome back to freedom. So these are the American hostages coming home in January of 1981. So in some ways, you can credit the Iranian hostage crisis in the ultimate defeat of President Carter for the presidency. We'll look at Ronald Reagan in the next chapter. Next, we'll look at some of the cultural changes and things that were ongoing during the 1970s here. We were seeing a shift during the 1970s, and we're still seeing this shift in these general directions still to this day. When you look at what factors are drawing people to the Sun Belt of the South and the West, this includes, parts of Arizona, Florida in the South. The West would include California. Many northern blue-collar industries, such as the automobile industry, suffered because of competition from Japan and other foreign countries. At the same time, new industries sprung up in the Southwest, in particular, oil in Texas, defense industries, and eventually, as we move into contemporary times, tech industries out west. Many Latin Americans, too, were immigrating to the United States, and they were settling in the southwestern United States. Changes in family life during the 1970s. By 1976, the birth rate had fallen to an all-time low. Parents and children began spending less time together. Divorce rate doubled from 1965 to 1979. Many people dubbed or nicknamed the 1970s the Me Decade. This came from Tom Wolfe, who was an author and writer for New York Magazine. He argued, in kind of his thesis of the 1970s, was that Americans had grown more self-obsessed, meaning caring more about themselves and becoming more superficial in terms of their lifestyle, opposed to, the close family unit that you probably were more familiar with during the 1950s. Something else that was developing during the 1970s was the New Age movement. New Age movement were kind of like alternatives to traditional religions. Many young people during the 1970s had turned their back on traditional religion. They began to look at self-healing as a way of bettering the world. Several cults kind of developed during this period of time, including the People's Temple, which was led by Jim Jones. The People's Temple, Jim Jones claimed to be the new Messiah or the new savior for society, and literally hundreds of people joined his cult. He was attempting to create a new utopian society in Guyana in South America. Then on November 18th, 1978, after many Americans were complaining that they had not seen their loved ones for a long period of time, they were concerned about their safety in this Jim Jones People's Temple in South America. So we sent down a member of the United States Congress and a delegation to kind of check on the citizens who were living in Guyana. The congressman was killed. And fearing that he would be apprehended, Jim Jones held one last party for his cult. And Jim Jones had his followers celebrate, dance, and drink Kool-Aid. And in the Kool-Aid was cyanide. And this was kind of like a mass suicide / mass murder of nearly 1,000 people. That's why they have the expression, don't drink the Kool-Aid. That expression basically means don't be an acceptor. Don't just do what somebody tells you. Kind of think things through yourself. Make your own informed decisions. And that was one of the biggest tragedies in history. Other activities that were part of the New Age movement: yoga, meditation, chanting, astrology all became popular during the 1970s. Popular trends, fads, and fashions in the 1970s, of which I have some of the images there. Many millions of people bought t-shirts with personalized messages on it. Skateboards were very popular for the first time during the 1970s. Exercising, fitness, aerobics was a new form of exercising, jogging, eating healthier. Tracksuits or jogging suits, as you see in the center photograph here. The pet rock was very popular during this period of time. You basically got that as a gift, and you actually kept that, let's say, on your desk in your room as your new pet. Why, I don't know. 43, why did fundamentalists and evangelical Christianity experience a resurgence in the 1970s? Why did more devout Christians, kind of in contradiction to the New Age movement that I mentioned? The growth of Christian fundamentalism was a reaction to some of these social changes that we mentioned here, both in the 60s and the 70s. Things like abortion, freer attitudes towards sex and drugs, restricted prayer in schools. Some of these Eastern religions and New Age movements, they felt like they had to kind of battle back almost against these new ideas. Falwell wanted government policies to support and help Christianity. We also saw the development in the 1970s of televangelists. These were ministers who preached on TV and attempted to solicit donations from those who were following and watching. And then when your overall evaluation in the 1970s, some of the problems that we faced during the 70s, obviously the aftermath of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, oil shortages, stagflation, which was the combination of increased prices for goods with stagnant economy and stagnant wages. That's kind of a double-edged problem in the 1970s. So hopefully you got a good indication of both the Ford presidency first and the Carter presidency and the overall view of the 1970s. For now, that's it. And Mr. Clark is out.